All right, welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube for my round 5 review of our loss to Carlton in a game that felt like it just continued to slip away across the entire 4 quarters until we found ourselves staring at quite a painful margin. In today's video, we'll be covering the best players from West Coast, the promising performances, and as always, key takeaways, including why it felt like a contest that continued to creep out of reach across the course of the game, rather than some of the more resounding demolitions that West Coast have suffered in the first 4 rounds of the 2025 season. But first, as always, I'd like to include my request to unsubscribed viewers just to consider subscribing to the channel and helping me reach that magical number of 1,000 that YouTube sets before allowing this content to become monetized. I know I mention it week in, week out, but until I reach that number, as I like to say, it really is just a very time-consuming passion of mine. And I do notice that there's expectations as well from the people that watch these videos, and it'll be a lot easier to meet those once I do reach that number and the channel becomes something more than just that. But anyway, let's get straight into the best players. At the top of the list was my most impactful player on the ground, and that was Liam Ryan. I honestly cannot speak enough to not only this guy's class and his finish, which all his teammates will say, but also his insane running power. There were 2 examples of the type of running that would get replayed all week during match review. The first was an offensive play that covered about 100 metres at full speed, Liam Ryan's full speed that is as well, starting in the middle of the ground with a gather and a burst of speed past 2 opponents, then a 50-metre kick inside 50 that he ended up getting on the end of and laying a tackle that prevented the ball exiting again. And that was after it travelled, past that 50-metre kick in the contest. So there was 100 metres worth of just top speed as well as contribution at every line. Incredible. The second one was also across pretty much that same distance, 100 metres. You guys can correct me if you've got your measuring tape out, but remember, it's not all in a straight line. He did turn some corners across some of these runs, but it was chasing down a chain of possessions by Carlton at top speed, almost getting, I think, the first guy in that chain of possessions, but then just continuing on to the next. And at the end of it, it was a holding the ball decision for the last guy on that chain. So for me personally, seeing a player finish up such a prolonged sprint effort like that, it rarely happens across the course of an entire season, let alone twice in one game. And it capped off a performance that also included 2 goals, several line-breaking runs through the middle of the ground, and a disposal efficiency that I think was above 80%. So exceptional performance from Liam Ryan. And it's also the type of leadership through example that West Coast is really screaming out for from our senior players this year, as I'm sure a few people have picked up through the week with selection. The next of our best players was Liam Baker, who led our possessions for the afternoon. And despite the score line that, again, was quite unflattering, but I'm going to get into how I think the Carlton loss stacks up to some of the really bad ones this year because it didn't feel as bad. But I'm happy to say that for once it didn't feel like he was on his own out there fighting the contest in the middle of the ground. Baker's possession tracker had clusters both in the middle of the ground and deep in defence. And like every week, he mostly picked them up at the bottom of the pack, right in the thick of things. And I think it's safe to say that 5 games into his career at West Coast, Baker is definitely now at the elite end of our senior known quantities, as I always like to say, that we can rely on week in, week out. One of the other bests, one that I don't really give too much credit to, I think often enough, is Jamie Cripps. He's, like I said, he's probably a guy that misses a bit of recognition from me when it comes to my known quantity players. I think with all the depth of talent that we have in the small to medium forward department, which I've spoken about at length throughout the preseason, it's easy to underestimate him. And after a couple of solid performances in recent weeks, he probably had his best game this week for the year. He was right at the top of our possession count in the first half, which admittedly wasn't a very high bar to set. But to go with that, there was an important goal when we desperately needed one. And for a bloke who's got over 250 games now, a bunch of competition in small forwards waiting just to push their way into the side, and I think he'll be turning 33 this month, he clearly isn't done just yet. So just a little quick shout out to Jamie Cripps, who really wasn't the best this week. And then the last mention from my best performers is Jack Graham. bit like Baker, it really felt like he finally wasn't fighting in the contest on his own this week, which is, I think if you guys, for everyone who watches my videos week in, week out, that is something I constantly find myself saying about Jack Graham. And it's a big step forward for the side collectively, even if the scoreboard still remained ugly at the end of the game. Other than that, it was the usual known quantity performance from Graham that I don't really need to go on about. And unfortunately, most of the best players today were from my known quantity players, and I'm going to try and stop saying that word over and over again. But really, it just leads into the promising performances, which there wasn't a huge number of. The only one that for me really stood out in this section was Tom Gross once again. For the second week in a row, he exceeded expectations from a first-year player who we picked up at 46 in the draft last year. I checked that after I made my guess last week. I think I said 33, but it's right up there. Gross collected 18 possessions over 4 quarters of pretty much pure midfield minutes. And I think it's a little bit like Tyrell Dewar in the first couple of games this season, where I feel like Gross is well on his way to establishing himself as a fixed asset in the weekly squad of 23. I can't see him being dropped after this week's performance anyway. So it's really more, as opposed to that brief window that you sometimes see the opportunity given to young guys just to get out there, get a couple of weeks so that they don't just get one and then sent back to the drawing board and the waffle to maybe find their spot in the side a little bit later in the year or another year. So what I think is also really exciting about Gross, and this is where that staple player hopefully will come from, is that for quite a long time now, for years, there's been a lack of players who just can simply accumulate the ball enough at West Coast. I mean, I'm sure other people have noticed, but if you look at the possession count every week, we rarely have anyone above 25, and I'm not even sure if we've had someone collect more than 30 possessions this year. I'm really optimistic that before the year's out, Tom Gross will be one of those absolutely essential accumulators that we've lacked for years in our squad. Other than Tom Gross, you're going to have to probably look at my, come back and watch my waffle review video at the end of the weekend to hear from more promising performances from our youngsters, because he was about it from the AFL side, unless I probably start to draw a slightly long bow, and I don't want to really dig too deep for these. It has to be meaningful. So that really just brings us to the key takeaways and what's probably going to be a slightly shorter video than usual this week. For the key takeaways, I'm going to go out and say it, but for another significant belting, this week didn't have that same sense of dominance that we experienced against Gold Coast and GWS, at least. Some of the stats did show a big differential in contested possession and overall possessions, but I think with the bulk of youngsters in the midfield especially, the aggression and that will to chase never really dropped all day. The big enemy for West Coast today was really poorly timed skill errors, in the middle of like a chain of really good ball movement. It was often a skill error that just ruined the chance at turning it into a goal. And then there was just inaccuracy as well that probably could have made it a much more respectable scoreline. So I think that's probably where I'm softening the end result today, is that I do think that there was no way that we deserved to win or anything like that, don't get me wrong. But the scoreline probably could have been a lot closer if it wasn't for skill errors at the wrong time and just some really unfortunate misses in front of goal. So my big call from today's game is following the waffle game that I watched half of last night. It's to watch out for the return of the Flynn. The big man now has a couple of best on ground performances for me for the Waffle Eagles, and should have well and truly earned the opportunity to have a hand in turning around our run of losses next week. So on that note, if, like me, you're interested in who's likely to come in and make an impact for the Eagles from the reserve side, keep an eye out for my waffle review video, which will be out in the next couple of days. Until then, thank you very much for tuning into the channel, and I'll see you guys again for the next review.